So in many aspects of his metaphysics, Anselm of Canterbury is best described as a Christian Platonist, or if you prefer, a neo-Platonist. And this might be argued to be an inheritance from the massive Augustinian influence on intellectual culture in Western Christianity, or from even broader currents of Christian philosophy incorporating influences of other church fathers. Gregory is very influential on him, John Cassian as well, or other Christian philosophers like Boethius. However we decide to view Anselm's thought in relation to its contemporary milieu and to his predecessors, it's clear that he found certain features of neo-Platonic metaphysics congenial enough to incorporate within his own philosophy. Among these is the conception of degrees of being, which plays an important role at a number of points in his work. Another centrally important aspect of Anselm's work is his conception of justice, which he defines as rectitude or rightness of will maintained for its own sake. Justice is the broadest and most architectonic sense of moral goodness in Anselm's moral theory. It's also not merely a matter in moral theory, but also one with metaphysical implications and involvements, not least because it's a fundamental state of the will and has to do with the relation between the human will, the created order, and God, who is in some sense justice itself. So the problem that I'm looking at in this paper has to do with the intersection between these two features of Anselm's thought, the degrees of being and his conception of justice. In Monologion, chapter 31, Anselm most explicitly articulates a hierarchy of created being in which he distinguishes 4 higher and lower gradations. So the question that I'm asking here is, could there be a 5th degree of being which would be justice or just being? This is admittedly not a problem Anselm explicitly endorsed, a position he endorsed, nor did he consider it as a problem in his written works, but it is one that does naturally arise when thinking through implications about topics where his metaphysics and moral theory intersect. So addressing it sheds additional light on other Anselmian problems and doctrines with which it's interconnected. I talk about that in the 4th part. It does possess a solution which remains faithful to Anselm's thought and texts, which is an Anselmian yes and no depending on how we regard the matter. You know, he's often called the scholastic doctor in part because he introduces all these distinctions, and this is one where he would be doing that. So the structure of what I'm doing here is relatively straightforward. The first section just sets out a selection of passages from Anselm's text, those that I have given you there, that are relevant to the question. The second part consists in exegesis of those passages, constructing an interpretation of Anselm in which this would correspond to a 5th degree of being higher than the other 4. In the third part, I examine the passages that would go against that interpretation. And in the 4th and final part, I argue for a qualified version of this interpretation of justice as a degree of being, and then I draw out some of its implications for a rational human being. 2 matters need to be briefly noted here before examining the passages. First, I don't intend to provide an argument or justification for Anselm's Neo-Platonism. Fortunately, I'm in a room where probably everyone is, more or less okay with entertaining the notion that there might be something to Platonism or Neo-Platonism. While the basic conception of degrees of being is indeed rejected by a lot of philosophical schools, which replace it with other basic conceptions, it is one that's representative of several different long-running philosophical traditions, and I intend to work out Anselm's views within those perspectives. Second, in this perspective, speaking of things possessing more or less degrees of being, more or less being does not always imply that one is pointing out higher and lower degrees. Setting aside quantitative differences within the same level or order of being, it's also possible for there to be qualitative differences that are not reducible to quantity. For instance, of the sort when we say that one work of art is more beautiful than another, or that it is truer to its subject than another, or that my wife is more just than I am. It does make some sense to speak of more or less being for such qualitative differences. If my wife is more just than I am, which is actually the case because she has less to be compelled to do what is just than I am, in some derivative sense, Anselm would say, we can say she possesses a greater degree of justice than I do, and in that sense she is more than I. It's more befitting to speak of degrees of being when differentiating how qualitatively higher and lower, greater and lesser levels of being. For Anselm, these degrees fit into a hierarchical structure perceptible to the human mind, which itself in its turn fits into that order. At the apex of this hierarchy for him is the triune God who possesses, or rather is, the absolutely highest degree of being, the summum and unity of every divine attribute. So the first part, I'm just looking at some passages that are relevant to the question. These are all from the Monologion or from the De Concordia. So sort of, bookends. First work, last work. If someone directs their attention to the natures of things, he senses that these are not contained in one sameness of dignity, but that some of them are distinguished by difference of degrees. For a person who doubts whether in its nature a horse be better than a piece of wood, and a human more excellent than a horse, really you ought not to be called human. This is one of the things that Anselm says. The next one, he says, if from some substance that lives and is sentient and is rational, that it is rational is stripped away by thought, then that it is sentient, and after this that it is something living, and finally that bare being that remains, who does not understand that this substance that is so bit by bit destroyed is entirely brought by degrees to less and less being, and in the end to non-being? But these things that taken away one by one reduce whatever essence or being you choose to less and less being. When the same things are taken on in order, they bring it to greater and greater being. So there's no doubt that every essence, by the degree that it is, more similar to that essence which is supremely and is supremely excellent, is more greatly and more excellently. Every created nature, the more that it is seen to approach the Word, takes its place at that higher degree of essence and dignity. Here's the third set of passages. He says, created beings are always in the Word, not what they are in themselves, but what is in that very same Word itself. The more they are similar to the Word, the more truly and excellently they exist. Second one, whatever is made, whether it lives or does not live, or whatsoever way it is in itself, in the Word is that very life and truth. And the third one, every created substance is more true in the Word, that is in the intelligence of the Creator, than it is in itself, to the extent that the creative essence exists more truly than the created. And finally, here's some passages from the De Concordia. The good that is justice truly is something, but the evil that is injustice lacks all existence. For injustice is not a quality or an action or some essence, but is insofar as an absence of that justice which is owed, and it is not except in the will where justice ought to be. And he also says, when the willing is rightly, then it is good and just. But when it is not rightly, by this alone that it is not rightly, it is evil and unjust. For to be rightly is something, but to not be rightly is not something. Now, just as when someone uses a sword or the tongue or the power of speaking, the sword or the tongue or the power are not one thing when their use is right, and another when its use is not right, so the will, which we use for willing, just like we use reason for reasoning, is not one thing when it is used rightly, and another thing when not rightly. The will is neither more nor less that which it is essentially when it is just than when it is not just. So, the second part now. This first passage both introduces the doctrine of degrees of being and notes a very important point about it. At a certain degree of being, that is rational being, creatures become aware of the degrees of being, and they become aware in a reflexive manner, locating themselves in other like beings at a particular degree in a hierarchy, at least potentially realizing that they're not the apex of it. In the second passage, Anselm details this thought experiment for us, progressively reducing a rational being down through greater and lesser determinations of being to bare being, then to non-being. Then, by adding these determinations, reconstitutes it in its full, what I call, ontological dignity. Clearly, in Anselm's perspective, nudum esse, indeterminate being, is hardly being at all, basically non-being. And certain determinations of being, like these levels of living, sentient, rational, are not mere predicates of an otherwise already constituted being. Instead, each one of them represents a greater richness, fullness, and intensity of being, a deeper engagement with being, which at rational being's level involves this reflexive self-awareness. This second passage also provides us a norm for ordering degrees of being and the things which possess varied degrees of being, the norm being that of similitude to the divine word, and Son. We know that the divine substance is whatever is absolutely better than what is not yet, he says, and that it does not have properties participating in such perfections, but rather is each perfection or divine attribute itself, as well as their perfect unity. Among these attributes or qualities, determinations of being corresponding to the four grades already distinguished. He says God is supreme essence. And when he says essence, essentia, it means something different than what we might look at it in a Thomistic sense, where essence and existence are distinguished or things like that. Anselm uses essentia in a kind of sloppy way. I probably shouldn't say sloppy, but it means being. It doesn't just mean essence in that sense. God has supreme essence, or rather is supreme essence, supreme life, supreme reason, and he also knows some things in some incomprehensible way. So he's supreme sentience as well. Anselm's list of attributes include a number of others, among which are supreme justice, supreme wisdom, and supreme truth. So given all that we've cited thus far, it would not be unreasonable to suppose that a being that is more just or more wise or more true is thereby more similar to God, thereby possesses a higher degree of ontological dignity. Several other inferences lend additional weight to this. Anselm maintains a just but not wise person seems better than one wise but not just. So given this priority, perhaps if any divine attribute a person participates in, besides the four we've already mentioned, ought to be construed as a higher degree of being, it should be justice. It might also be significant that justice is the very attribute that Anselm uses to illustrate God's unique and supreme way of being the divine attributes. And if a thing's being more or less true arguably reflects greater or lesser degrees of being, then surely justice, which in its broad sense is mutually defined by truth and rightness, and its narrower sense involves rightness or truth of will, should likewise involve greater and lesser degrees of being. Lastly, in Anselm's numerous discussions of human and angelic justice and injustice, it seems clear that not only do justice and injustice each admit of quantitative or qualitative degrees, so that a person can be said to be more or less just, but also that justice by its very nature is either possessed or not possessed. He speaks of it in two complementary ways. If anything is a candidate for a higher degree of being, would it not be the justice a human being possesses, which Anselm says, not even God can take away if that person wills properly, but which, once lost by justice's very nature, one cannot recover by one's own power. So in this interpretation, for a human being, the state of justice is or involves a higher degree of being than that of merely rational being. The latter, in turn, is higher than other progressively lesser degrees of being. So ranging from lowest to highest, human being would potentially comprise first mere being, pneudamessa, living being, sentient being, rational being, and then just being. At each higher level, there is an advance, a leap beyond the lower level. The creature has more being, it exists and relates to the rest of created being in a richer way. At the same time, while the lower level is transcended by the higher for created beings, the lower level is also required as a basis, a radically transformed one, for the higher level. For instance, without being alive, one cannot be sentient. More importantly, justice requires rationality. An important difference between just being and the other degrees of being, however, is that justice can be, and is in many cases, lost. So in this interpretation, a just human being would occupy a higher degree of being than an unjust human being, who presumably then occupies mere rational being's degree of being. The third set of passages would seem to strengthen this interpretation. In these passages, the being or existence of created things as they are in themselves, that is, in the world we experience, is contrasted against the being of those things as they are in the Word, in God. They come out lesser, greatly lesser in the comparison. And for us human beings, original sin, its manifold effects, and injustice play significant parts in this disjunction between the more real ways human beings are in God's mind, that is, the ways in which God intends them to be, and the ways they are in the less real, less true, less just, but still quite existent created order. So for a human being to become more just, or for a previously unjust human being to become just, would be for that human being to become more like to what they truly are in God's mind. And when a person is just, they are in themselves more like what they are in God's mind. Since, as Anselm says, nothing should be other than what it is in the supreme truth, the very act of becoming more just, thus more like what one is in the supreme truth, thereby renders one still more intensely just. So again, this would go to support this notion of justice as being a higher degree of being. Now, I notice I brought in some pretty questionable ideas that, there's me existing in God's mind over there, and that me is more real than the me who's talking to you right now. And there's some clarification that's probably required of that. But here's the challenges to the interpretation, coming from the De Concordia. Passages like those in section D problematize this interpretation. Worse, even if one were to succumb to temptation to maintain an attractive but questionable interpretation by saying, well, those are just from the De Concordia, so they're not really that characteristic. There's so many similar passages that crop up through Anselm's corpus, one would be forced to concede that these passages really do reflect central and unavoidable Anselmian doctrines. So what are these, and what problems do they raise for the interpretation so far? One doctrine, essential to understanding Anselm's views, is this. Justice is fundamentally a matter of the rational creature's will. Justice, he says, is that very good by which angels and men are good, that is just, and through which the will itself is called good or just. Justice, however, primarily resides in and is a quality of the will, and likewise does injustice the privation of justice. A will is and is called just or unjust, depending on the presence or lack of justice within it, and derivatively, actions, hearts, human beings as a whole, and angels are said to be just or unjust. So after noting that, consider three problems for interpreting justice as a degree of being stemming from Anselm's texts concerning the will, justice, and injustice. The first problem is that since the just will is not more a will than the unjust will, it would seem that justice does not make the will a different being, possessed of more being, a higher degree of being. It simply qualifies the will as just as having the property of justice rather than its contrary, injustice. There are other passages where Anselm does speak as if not only the just will but also the unjust will are something, raising a second problem. If both justice and injustice are something, and human beings can possess either one, it hardly seems that justice could be a degree of being in the way that rationality or sentience are, where the quality is constitutive of that very being. Third problem arises from other passages which specify that justice is something, but that injustice is nothing, merely the lack of justice in the rational being. If injustice really is nothing, how can its opposite be something so much that it constitutes yet a higher degree of being than rationality? So it should be evident that as I've stated these three problems cannot all challenge the interpretation together because they seem incompatible with each other. It also should seem obvious to readers familiar with Anselm's metaphysics and moral theory that I've isolated parts of Anselm's thought from each other, so the solution lies in reconstructing the proper context for these. The third problem, on consideration, turns out to rest on a dialectic stopped short that presumes that all the opposites will be of the same level or order of being as each other. If injustice is nothing but the privation of justice where it ought to be in a rational being, there is no reason, offhand, why justice could not be something so important, valuable, and powerful as to represent the elevation of the human being to intrinsically higher degree of being. Anselm, in fact, signals a necessary priority which justice possesses over injustice. If anything, the gulf of difference between the nothing and something would seem to argue for justice being a degree of being, or at least not rule it out. But the first and second raise more substantive problems. A human being cannot exist as such without possessing rationality or life, though of course the human being does not possess any of these qualities totally because only God does, for Anselm. A human being can, however, exist without justice or without injustice, albeit they cannot exist concretely without having one of them. And considered solely in terms of the will, Anselm makes this distinction. The will is instrumentum, the will as the instrument, It is true that justice does not add anything to the will, since the will remains what it is essentially. But in the other senses of will, Anselm distinguishes will as usus or occasion or the actual exercise, and will as affectio or inclination. The restoration, presence, or preservation of justice does actually add something to the will, and injustice actually does take something away from the will. One of the two most basic inclinations of the will is, in fact, what he calls the will to justice, which not only is something, but something exceedingly good. Injustice is precisely a lack, the absence or privation of will as inclination for justice. The case for will as occasion or usus is less straightforward and obvious. In an interest in time, I pass over it here to look at the second problem's challenge, namely that injustice in the will, strictly speaking, a privation of what should be there, is yet in some sense something unjust or evil. He actually does concede. Common use calls the affects and acts of the unjust will, which considered themselves are something, injustice, but denies that injustice itself has any essence or being. Still, in numerous works, Anselm does paint detailed pictures of the varied forms, some of them quite complex and enduring. This privation assumes in the subject matter of the unjust will. These are closely connected with the other genre of evils in addition to, and ultimately products of, injustice, which Anselm terms detriment. In some cases themselves privations, in other cases positively some things. Like an addiction, for example. He doesn't use that term, of course, but that would be a great example. While injustice, considered strictly in itself, is nothing, in its effects, its concrete manifestations, even in the tenor of its lack of the will, it does seem something, possessed of some degree of being. So in that case, both injustice and justice, justice and injustice, the first entirely, the second in a sense, do have being. Now, here's how I sort of come to some sort of solution for Anselm on this. He says, to ask the key question again, does justice in the will, and therefore in the human being as a totality, bring or entail a higher degree of being? So Anselm's doctrine, as I've reconstructed it here, seems to rule out justice being interpreted as a degree of being entirely analogous to those placed below it by that interpretation. It's worth recalling that each higher degree both transcends and transformationally incorporates the lower degree, and that for each of these degrees of being, the beings which possess them cannot be what they are, lacking them. At least in some respects, the human will and the human being can lack justice and yet remain what it is essentially. And while justice could be said to transformationally incorporate rational being, it does not, except as divine justice, transcend rational being. In fact, it's more apt and appropriate to say that an Anselmian justice is something arising as an essential and normative possibility for the rational being from that being's rationality. So it's a perfectioning of rational being, a growth in its rationality, and a condition for its rationality's effectiveness. In this sense, justice is an augmentation in being of the rational human being, a deepening of the determinative reflexivity and relationality characteristic of and arising at that degree of being. So in this limited sense, one could affirm that justice is a higher degree of being. So we have our Anselmian yes and no depending. Before ending, I would like to lay out 4 considerations about the relations between justice and rational being in Anselm's thought, and I put a lot of the argumentation and exegesis in the footnotes. The first one is this. Will and reason for Anselm are inextricably connected in rational beings. Both are structured in a teleological framework that justice makes effective, and injustice stymies and distorts. So justice is what permits rational being to be rational being more fully. The second consideration is that as rational beings, we are inevitably, but also by our free will and irresponsibility, caught up with either justice or its privation. And if justice is not an entire degree of being, there is such a gulf for Anselm between justice and injustice. That injustice can generate for rational beings not only inability to recover, do, or keep justice, but even to understand it adequately, as well as casting the will and the reason of the rational being into servitude. The third consideration has to do with the reflexivity of rational being, which is deepened and expanded by justice when it's present, making possible genuine freedom and self-knowledge, and revealing and reinforcing the true framework of justice in the will. This leads in turn to the fourth and final consideration, justice's relationality, necessarily involving and promoting the rational's being participation in the economy of divine justice and wisdom. To regard justice as something primarily in or possessed by a human being or a human will is ultimately a too partial view for Anselm. He doesn't say this, but this is sort of an implication of his discussions. Justice in the will involves rational recognition of and volitional harmonization with something transcending the human will, an order of divine justice that is ultimately God himself. So the will to justice, to preserve rightness of will for its own sake, is preservation of something the rational creature does possess, but participationally, by participating in a norm of justice that also exceeds the boundaries of the creature. So ultimately, just as he says for truth in the De Veritate, rather than justice merely being in us, we are and we find ourselves in justice. Thanks. Okay, so now, a lot of, Anselm is an unusual guy, when it comes to some of the things he believes in. Yeah.
Well, when I was reading your paper last night, and you changed it a little bit from, I guess, the text that I had.
The beginning, yeah.
I wasn't sure, and reading it again with you, and I think I may have the answer, but I was struck by the idea that if justice is a higher perfection of being, or if it belongs to a different order of being, and I'm not sure if I'm saying this the right way, the question seemed to arise in my own mind, if a person were supremely just as a human being, would they cease to be human?
No, they would be most fully human. I mean, that would be Christ for Anselm.
Well, see, you talked about a hierarchy of beings, starting with the triune God, and so, down to inner matter. And, we have a place for the angels, and we have a place for men and animals and that kind of thing. But and I guess I was misinterpreting what Anselm was saying, because it seemed to me that he was saying that there was just a higher order of being. And I was thinking of some of the old theology, for instance. Well, I better not characterize it as old theology, because Peter had jumped all over. Some of the theology, for instance, surrounding the sacraments in Catholic theology, that there is a character imparted to the recipient of the sacrament, such that the individual is marked, and that character changes the person. And now I've heard colleagues of mine speak, for instance, those who were ordained priests, that they were ontologically changed.
Yeah.
And my answer to them then is, well, did you cease to be a human being? And because if you're ontologically changed, and that's what I was reading Anselm to be saying, that a perfectly just person is ontologically changed. It's a higher ontological state. And then I said, well,
what are they then?
Well, yeah, what are they?
Are they? Yeah, I mean,
it's an accidental ontological change as opposed to a substantial ontological change. What is you?
Well,
which one are you saying is the accidental ontological change?
The character of the sacrament.
Of the sacrament, yeah.
Or being raised up to justice.
Well, it certainly is not the way some of my colleagues, were interpreting it. They did not make that decision.
They don't cease being a human being because of that.
Oh, no, but like you said, each step transcends the next step. So you don't cease being a sentient being, you don't cease being a rational being, but now you are a just being.
Does that make you a super being?
Well, that's my question. That's
well, I'll put it to you this way.
What about angelic beings who are also, they also have wills?
The good angels.
Yeah, the good angels versus the bad angels. So.
They can't fall. They can't lose the justice which they possess. We can when we have a state of justice.
And that's what I was wondering about, that higher state. If we still have the possibility of always losing it, then I'm not sure we've ever gone anywhere except...
Yeah, but we only lose it through, Anselm says, through our own will, through preferring some good other than keeping that very justice in the will. And we don't conceptualize it. We always, we always think of it instead of, no, I'm just going to do this one thing, make this exception for myself at this time. But yeah, we have the possibility of losing it. It doesn't transform our being in such a way that, like some people have this, once saved, always saved, I can do anything sort of theology. He doesn't have anything like that.
We have that one with the Catholics with the ongoing process, so like maybe if I got through cooperative grace to sanctifying grace, maybe I would be to the point where I wouldn't change.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have the possibility of turning away.
No, that's glory. You have to wait till glory before you can't turn away.
Sorry?
You have to wait till glory before you can't.
Well, then we're back to nothing has really changed then.
Well, no, things have changed. They just haven't changed in such a way as to turn us into automatons of grace, so to speak. We still have.
Ontologically, though. What else?
I mean, we're in if we have the state of justice that Anselm, as he conceives of it, we can also still grow within it. And once we're in it, he thinks there's nothing keeping us actually from leaving it except for our own will, which is screwed up, damaged. We may be placed in situations where there's a lot of pressure brought to bear on us, but he thinks that one can, once there is justice in the will, one can always persevere. He also thinks that if you've lost that, it's not that everything you do is going to be totally flawed and you can never do the right thing. He says you can't keep from sinning. You can't keep from committing more injustice. You can in individual circumstances, but you're going to give in sooner or later and do the wrong thing. I don't know if that goes to answering. Well, we started with your question.
Yeah, well, I guess, as you got towards the end of your talk, then it seemed to me that my question was losing some of its vigor. Because you said, while justice could be said to transformationally incorporate rational being, it does not transcend rational being. So as I read that, I underlined it again. I said, maybe that's the answer to my question, that he would not really propose that the fully just person transcends the rational human person.
Yeah, and I'm pushing Anselm beyond what he actually says, too, to be quite honest. A lot of the things that I've got as the Anselmian thing in here are not things that he said directly. They're sort of implications of putting together parts of his idea. I think the strangest thing that he actually says that I mentioned in here is this notion that there's a me who is the true me, who exists in God, and the more that I become like that, the more just I am, the more real I am. He says being in itself, this kind of being, not the being of a copy or something like that, is still not as real as that undamaged or redeemed me in the mind of God. It's hard to even think how to.
Well, that gets me back then to my original question. It sounds like you're drifting back there then,
Drifting back to
my original question, or my interpretation of Anselm as I understood you were,
Well, are we talking about theosis here? Is that what the question
sorry?
is? Are we talking about theosis here, the sort of becoming God notion?
No,
It's just
no.
the perfect idea of me in God's mind.
Yeah.
Isn't it neo-Platonic or Platonic?
It is, yeah.
So
Although that also is God. It's
Right, well, right,
Yeah.
that's the standard, isn't that the sort of high scholastic view that the ideas in God are not really distinct, but just relative to the particular thing.
Exactly. And they're constitutive of the things of the world, too. Anselm is neo-Platonist in that respect, thoroughly. And it's not like he ever. There's some things in him that are clearly neo-Platonist. This degrees of being business, this in the existing in the whatever we want to call it, in the Godhead, in God, the triune God. His doctrine of participation, which is hard to make sense out of because he doesn't tell us much about it. What is it to participate in justice? I'm still trying to work that out.
It's in Plato, sure.
Yeah.
Well, but that's not much of an answer for Anselm, because he wouldn't have had much Plato to work with.
Well, so what was he working? What was the neo-Platonic sources that he had? Dionysius?
Well, Augustine, for one,
Augustine.
and Boethius, who's arguably neo-Platonic. And this kind of Platonism runs through some of the church fathers who he had, like, for instance, John Cassian. Benedict recommends Cassian as somebody who the monks should read. In that case, it's less about sort of metaphysics on a grand scale, and more about the metaphysics of the human person. So the monks out in the desert, for example, as Cassian at least depicts them, use the tripartite soul notion coming from Plato. They also incorporate some things from Stoicism too. I don't know if they have the De Natura Deorum, but there's arguments from Degrees of Being in there in Cicero. The monks did have some Cicero, and Anselm read all sorts of. We don't know much specifically by his references to what he's read, because he's one of the few authors at the time who doesn't quote sources. Catherine Rogers actually says that, and I don't fully agree with her on this, that we should just see, anytime that we don't have an answer in Anselm, we should just go to Augustine, because he thought Augustine was on track. So therefore, if he didn't bring it up, he didn't think it needed to be added to. But people like Robert Boucher say that Gregory is almost as important an influence as Augustine when it comes to the notion of justice as rectitude. I accept that argument. He's a cagey guy. We have these writings that he decided to set down because monks pestered him into writing, and then he wrote a few because he thought they really needed them. And then pressures of work kept him from getting too much else written in terms of high theology. He never actually did get to address, at least the story, he didn't get to address his treatise that he wanted to write on soul, and figured that nobody after him was going to do a good enough job on it. So a lot of this is quite speculative.
But you were talking about injustice. Right?
Yeah.
And you were saying that in a way it exists for Anselm as well as it doesn't exist?
Yes.
Because that's a very non-Augustinian idea. Evil has any kind of being at all.
The being that evil has is through the corruption of what being that there is, which is Augustinian. He uses other language, which is interesting than Augustine.
But I wonder why you thought that was any problem, that you thought injustice had some kind of being. All he means is it has.
Well,
it had
if we want to say
in perfect being,
Relative being to.
I don't think that's a problem for his schema in general. But if we want to say that there's like these levels or grades or degrees of being, then if injustice and justice both have being,
well, injustice doesn't have being. That's the point. I mean, so
yeah, it doesn't, but it does kind of in a way, but not in a real way.
Well, like a hole in the ground. Okay.
Yeah.
Does the hole in the ground exist or does it not?
Yeah, except like a hole in the ground filled with glass that shouldn't be there. That you step in. That'd be more apt.
Well, but now you've got something in the hole, so it's no longer
Yes.
a hole.
Yeah. And there is some presence of, just like if I'm addicted to something, and let's say I'm a totally intemperate guy because all I do is I can't get enough Perrier.
Well, then there's a disorder in your appetite.
There is, but for Anselm that would also be something in the will that's a form of injustice.
A lack of order.
Yeah, exactly.
But is that just another lack?
It's not just a lack of order, though. It's also a misorder, too, to a certain degree. This is why it's very difficult to talk about evil as merely privation, or at least it is for me, yeah.